Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited to have you here for Confronting Racism, Causes and Strategies for Addressing Race-Based Trauma in Children, presented by Bright Promises Foundation. I'm happy to hand it over to Ed Davies, who will serve as our moderator today. Ed, please go ahead and take the floor.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you everyone for joining us today for our conversation regarding race-based trauma and its impact on children and youth. We're excited to engage you in this conversation. I know the panelists that we've assembled are excited to share with you what we have learned and have experienced in supporting youth with this issue. And so again, as Catherine said, thank you for joining us. Welcome from the Bright Promises Foundation. When we, when we started this work, this is born out of our focus panel process, which is our innovative approach to addressing issues that affect children and youth in the metropolitan Chicago area. And our panelists today were a part of that process with us. And so we're excited to be launching our new focus panel process, which is focused on addressing racially based trauma in children and youth. And as we titled it, our Healing, Leading, and Changing project. And the Healing, Leading, and Changing is the work that we want to facilitate young people being able to do in addressing this issue. For Bright Promises, we've had years of leadership and experience in working on many issues related to children. Primarily, previous focus panels have touched on childhood trauma and also social emotional learning. And so focusing on racially based trauma has been the evolution of the work that we started close to 20 years ago in this space. So I'm not going to take up too much time. I'm going to turn it over to our panelists in just a second. Excuse me, just a few housekeeping tips. That you'll be muted during the conversation. We will have time for questions and answers at the end of the panel, not too many, but please, if you have questions that you would like us to address, please use the chat function to place those questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. But also want to emphasize that this is just the start of a conversation in our eyes and not the culmination and not just a one-time event. So hopefully the questions that you have, the information also that you can share to enlighten all of us will be used for future conversations and action around this very important issue that unfortunately impacts far too many children and youth in the Chicago area. I'm pleased to be here wearing two hats. One as the program chair for the Bright Promises board of the Program and Advocacy Committee. And as I said, Bright Promises has been committed to issues facing children and youth and providing innovative solutions for those issues for a number of years. I've only been on the board for 2 years, but I'm happy to join such a group of committed individuals in this area who are supporting kids. But also wearing my day job hat, which is the Director of Community Initiatives at Children's Home and Aid. And this ties very well into our continued focus and renewed focus on addressing how race plays a factor in the lives of the families we support and the work that we have to do as an organization, both internally and externally, in how we address this issue and recognizing how intricately linked race is to outcomes for children and families and how we need to shift that. And so I'm fortunate to represent both of those interests here in this work and the leadership of our organization at Children's Home and Aid, both the board and Mike Shaver as our CEO, in leading that work and joining Bright Promises and the work the leadership of that organization is doing to advance this issue. So without further ado, I will have each of our panelists introduce themselves, and then we will get into our discussion. First up, I'll let Alec, you would kick us off.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here and have enjoyed thoroughly the conversations that we as a panel have had, both through our focus groups in preparation for this event this afternoon. My name is Alec Ross, and I am the Senior Director of Clinical Services at Juvenile Protective Association in Chicago.
Great. Thank you. Amy?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Hilado. I'm a clinician and an academic researcher in refugee and immigrant mental health. And like Ed, I have two hats. I'm the founding clinical director of the Refugee One Wellness Program, a mental health program for refugees and immigrants. And I'm also an associate professor of social work at Northeastern Illinois University, where I teach and do research in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Amber, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amber Mason. I am the Director of Evaluation for Planning, Implementation, and Evaluation, also known as PI.org. We have the honor to partner with Bright Promises Foundations as they build the Healing, Leading, Changing initiative, and working with them to build an evaluation that is responsive to the needs of youth and the communities that are served through the initiative.
Thank you, Amber. Looking forward to hearing more from you. And last but certainly not least, Clinton.
Hello, everyone. Words are inadequate to express how humbled and honored I am to be with you all today. And I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with everybody in the virtual audience. I'm, again, Clinton Boyd Jr., and I'm a postdoctoral associate at the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. A vast majority of my research focuses on parenting in Black families with an emphasis on fathers. And I tend to take a very, I take a race and social equity approach to my work. And much of the work that I do with Black fathers focuses on those men who are returning citizens and those who have just been involved with the criminal legal system. So I kick it back to you, Ed.
Excited to have our panelists here, and I know we have billed them as experts and they'll live up to that billing, but we also recognize that many of you are experts in your own right in this space. So we hope to create and further a community of practice where we all bring our experience and also our expertise to discussing this issue. So you received the pre-event email, I believe yesterday, in asking asking participants to share a word that best describes what you hope to learn from this event. And we created a word cloud that we're sharing with you now just to see what some of you have said and want to center this in terms of what we hope to get out of today and being mindful of what you came to get out of this. So you see big words like healing and curiosity and trauma. We also see, words around motivation and community embedding racial equity, which I think is also important for us to be able to do. Understanding others' POV and a point of view, and many other words here, allyship, another a big word here. And so we recognize that, this is why you're here. We recognize that we can help support each other in understanding each of these areas. And hopefully that, again, this will bring us closer together and be bound by our differences versus separated by them in addressing this issue. So we'll go ahead and get into our discussion at this point. Catherine, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen briefly. And so one, we just wanted to start with a definition of what we mean by racially based trauma, and the definition that we'll use in today's conversation. So racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress refers to the mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with racial bias and ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. So there may be other ways that you think about this, this space, that you think about this issue, but we want to use this as our working definition for today's conversation. And so with that in mind, one of the things that I want to ask our panelists is for you all to share why race. We understand that trauma is a universal experience for many of us, regardless of our race, our gender, our socioeconomic status. Many of us have experienced some form of trauma. But why do you feel that race is an important lens on trauma that requires our attention, especially as it relates to young people?
I'm happy to jump in here. I think we recognize that children and youth that all of us are not defined by any one aspect of our identity, because we live and we exist at the intersection of multiple social and political identities that are not, like you said, Ed, limited to race, class, and gender. And bringing in that piece of trauma, we on this panel, affiliated with Bright Promises, we recognize that children and youth experience diverse traumas. But part of our conversation today is about zeroing in on that intersection between race and trauma, because there's a specific impact when we see that what you described, race-based trauma, the emotional, the mental injury, there's a direct impact on child and youth development. And that's why we're all here to talk about that. Because when we think about its impact, it's really about psychological safety and trust impacted by race-based trauma that informs how children and youth can take in information, how they're able to experience. I think about developing healthy relationships. I think about developing healthy adaptive skills, and all of that guides healthy self-development. We want that for all children and youth. But what we find with race-based trauma specifically is that it informs and influences how children and youth see themselves and how they see others. It informs how they believe they can and how they should navigate the world. And that's not predicated on one experience of a race-based traumatic event or a series of race-based traumatic events. It's on this toxic environmental condition where kids, they can't separate race from their home life, from the conversations, the experiences in schools and communities. And that for me is why we've got to center in at this intersection of race and trauma. It doesn't just hit kids at the individual level, it's so much more far-reaching than that.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Other thoughts from panelists?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick to build on many of the wonderful points Amy made. And I'll add by saying that there's a historical component to race-based trauma, especially when you think about certain communities that have been racialized or minoritized within the US context, right? And again, as somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about Black men, Black fathers, and the Black family as an institution writ large, even when I reflect on the summer that we just had, which has continued into this present day in terms of like the racial reckoning that's been taking place, I often think about the spectacle of violence, right? And taking it all the way back to the institution of slavery, and even thinking about the Jim Crow era when we had public events that were really social events, right? If you think about lynchings, for example, this wasn't just about punishing the alleged perpetrator, right? It was also about sending a message to a larger community that if you tried to disturb the status quo, the racial status quo, there were lethal consequences for doing so. And it also reinforced this whole notion of white supremacy, this whole notion that white is right. And that in and of itself has historically been deeply problematic. And that is also a part of who America truly is. Even when I think about the attempted coup that took place on January 6th or the insurrection, right? A lot of the rhetoric in the aftermath was, this is so un-American. This is not who we are. But when you really know America's true history, this is exactly who we are. But the thing that we have been consistent about is the denial of truth. The denial of certain communities' marginalization at the hands of government, because it's not just about this being racialized state violence, but in many cases it was state-sanctioned violence because our government officials consciously did not want to do anything about the real racial terror that was taking place, that was afflicting certain communities. And that in and of itself is something that needs to be discussed more openly. And I'm just glad that Bright Promises has created a platform for us to even engage in this honest dialogue.
Well, I agree with certainly everything that's been said from a clinical perspective in terms of the work that we do with children. I think another slice of this is that most of the ways as clinicians we come about defining and thinking about trauma, I think Amy touched on this, and then also the models of intervention, the treatment models we use are primarily informed by dominant white Eurocentric ways of thinking about psychology, pathology, and treatment. And I think it's vitally important. It's what we do at JPA is really looking at racially sensitive ways of not only defining trauma and working with our constituents, teachers, community members, parents, caregivers, and the children themselves, but also looking at other ways of thinking about healing and recovery that aren't necessarily informed by some of the dominant practices and ways of thinking. And this is so important because we're using models of ways of thinking about race, about trauma and treating trauma that just aren't appropriate and aren't effective.
And just real quick, I just want to add, from my space, I come from the perspective of program evaluation. And often when we think about evaluation, people think of numbers and data. And but the way we see it, or the way I see it in my positionality, is it's important that we are highlighting a story, and not just a story, but the truth, and as Clinton articulated, but the transparent part of the story. And within that, race is a very important factor that we must consider, and we must take on that lens when we think about how we measure, how we share impact of these spaces, of the work of organizations that seek to mitigate issues related to racial trauma. So that's why it's very important. I know some people might ask why me as an evaluator is part of this conversation, but I think at a very important part, we are the people who tell the story. So it's important to use that racial-based lens when telling the story at every front.
Thank you all for sharing that. It's from what I'm gathering from the group, it's also important to understand that given the society and the structure of this society to be one rooted in white supremacy and privilege, that race and racially based trauma is a part of everyone's existence and it can't be escaped. And the analogy that I really like that I've heard used oftentimes is that racism isn't the shark in the water, it is the water itself. Like we are submerged in it, we live in it, we breathe it every day. It shows up at the individual level, the institutional level, and the structural level. And so if all of those levels that impact our lives every day are rooted in some ways in race, it's important that we understand the impact of that on those individuals of our community who are the least equipped to deal with it and the most vulnerable, which are our children and youth. And so one of the conversations we want to have today is understanding what that impact is on our children and youth, to underscore why this is so important for us to deal with. And so again, this is taken from a white paper that we can share that Bright Promises wrote in support of its new focus panel on healing, leading, and changing. And it says that trauma caused by racism affects BIPOC children and youth in much the same way that general trauma does. The research has linked racism to physical and psychological symptoms, including fear and hypervigilance, headaches, insomnia, body aches, memory difficulty, self-blame, confusion, shame, and guilt after experiencing racism. In children and youth, trauma can also be expressed through adverse behavior, retreating inwards, inability to concentrate, or fight or flight responses. And when we think about those terms that are being used to describe that, we see how many of those things get translated into how we deal with children. So not dealing with the issue or the symptom of racially based trauma, but we deal with the behavior. We deal with the low performance in school. We deal with, their choosing at-risk or what we say non-pro-social behaviors as a way of coping with it. And we treat those symptoms versus helping young people deal with the root cause of it, which is race-based trauma. And so my next question for the panelists, like building off of that, is what have you seen in each of your spaces as the adverse impact of racially based trauma on children?
Well, I could talk a little bit about our work. We provide school-based therapy, so we're in the schools. And so much of what you're talking about, Ed, is what we see every single day. In terms of children's capacity to learn and be present in a learning situation when the night before they couldn't sleep. We're hearing a lot of young kids just not being able to get to sleep, anticipating traumatic events, violent events to occur overnight. The other thing that we see a lot is young people, mostly males, who what I think is the hypervigilant behavior in the classroom being viewed through, again, this white lens and being diagnosed with symptoms of attention deficit disorder and referred over to hospitals and put on medication to treat, again, the behavior, but never really getting at or addressing sort of the root causes or what's lying beneath that. And so what we see is impairment in capacity and ability to show up and be present and participate in learning. And then the behavior getting sort of misperceived and dealt with instead of being able to engage the children in conversations and play, which is what we use with younger children, to find ways of meaningfully expressing and being able to unpack some of these events that they experience not just once, but I think Amy said it too, it's ongoing. It's not like a traumatic event, it's every day. So that's what we're seeing in the schools.
I want to build on what Alec is saying, and thinking before children enter school, what's happening in the early years that is really working against children when we think about race-based trauma and working against families so that children are not starting preschool and kindergarten ready to learn because of the impact of race-based trauma. As I mentioned, I work with forcibly displaced refugee and immigrant families, and I will say that a lot of this kind of the race-based violence intersecting with gender-based violence, anti-Muslim violence, anti-immigrant violence is incredibly activating for our families because it's reminiscent of the reasons why they left their countries in the first place. And so when I look at what we're seeing in our practice and even the growing research around this, that we are seeing more evidence that speaks to the impact of race-based discrimination on parenting. And it's being linked to child behavioral and developmental outcomes. And so if I could flesh that out even quicker than that, or just even more, the stress and the anxiety and the depression of being discriminated upon is impacting a parent's ability to tune into their kids. And what we know in child development literature, what we know in the practice is that young children will struggle if they don't have parents who can model self-regulation and compassion and attuned communication, all these things that are the foundation for healthy development. It's early childhood mental health in a nutshell. This isn't pitting blame on parents, but it's recognizing that there is an intergenerational impact of race-based trauma. And when parents are struggling, their children will struggle as well. And when we don't provide supports, these are kids that are going to be holding on to such big emotions that they're not going to start preschool and kindergarten ready to learn their ABCs and their 1, 2, 3s because they're navigating these huge emotions without the ability to cope. And that's something that we're seeing in families specifically. A good example of a subset within children and families, within children and youth that are directly impacted by race-based trauma.
I'd just like to add, in our work, in my work with Pi.org through program evaluation, we've been honored with working with a number of youth serving organizations, educational and social impact organizations that seek to highlight the impact of their various program initiatives that are designed to mitigate equity and learning gap issues that are directly and indirectly related to issues of racial trauma. And what we've often found through the feedback is that staff, instructors, administrators actually feel at times that they don't have the tools, that there's a lack of knowledge and information necessary to identify these issues and promote inclusive spaces, not just for adults, but also for our youth, and appropriately respond to these issues related to racial-based trauma. And also void in a lot of this is the youth voice. So our role with Bright Promises is, of course, to think more intentionally about how to incorporate the appropriate voices to understand what are the issues, how can we mitigate these gaps, and how can we understand the story more appropriately, so that we're not just doing things for the sake of saying, oh, we have a racial-based trauma program, but also really moving the needle in closing some of these educational gaps.
Real quickly, I'll just add that um, it's an emerging body of work or research rather that is really focusing on young adults who we would consider to be opportunity youth, right? Young folks between the ages of 16 to 24, many of whom are disconnected from school and disconnected from work. And over the past year, I've been doing a lot more work with those opportunity youth who identify as fathers. And one of the things that has constantly come up in these conversations is the ways in which these young fathers are simply treated as antagonists by the public and private systems that they interface with, right? And a lot of that has to do with, when they show up to family court, when they show up to child support offices, or when they're trying to secure public assistance because they may be a single father, and only to be treated as if they are not a responsible parent, right? A lot of times, because of the negative racial stereotypes that we tend to attach to Black fathers throughout society writ large, that views them as a liability to the family opposed to as an asset. And as a result of that, many of the young fathers find themselves, seeing their emotional well-being being negatively impacted as a result of them feeling as if they are not being embraced by the very systems and institutions that are supposed to be supporting parents and youth in their efforts to provide a meaningful lifestyle for their children. And I just wanted to introduce that into the conversation because, again, when we talk about youth, we have to broaden our definition of who falls underneath that umbrella category and term, because many of our young people between the ages of 16 and 24, they are also youth as well, and not fully at a place where they can be self-sufficient to the point where they would like.
So we want to turn our attention to what can we do about this, and what are the opportunities to support young people in this work and in this space. So before we do that, I want to go back to our working definition, not our working definition, but to what we try and help young people understand and accomplish in this space. And so research has shown that an important aspect of healing from trauma caused by racism is to engage in empowerment through resistance, as racism often causes helplessness, hopelessness, and avoidance and fatigue. And we see this in adults as much as we see it in young people also. And so Bright Promises was very intentional about calling this initiative Healing, Leading, and Changing, because we understand that a part of healing is taking agency and using your power to address the issue, which ultimately leads to the leading and the changing. And so helping you to exercise their own agency and supporting you to feel empowered to bring about equity are important and effective to both support healing from racially based traumatic stress and to give rise to the change we need as a society. And so I want to spend some time talking about two things, panelists. One, what do adults need to do in order to support young people in both the healing, but also in their ability to create change around this issue? And two, what are some of the things that we should be asking young people to engage in, exercising their agency and their power around this issue? It's important for us to understand something, that this isn't a problem for young people to fix. It's important for us to understand that a lot of this is based on what must happen in society, within our institutions, within our systems of government. But we also recognize that we have some agency in influencing those institutions, those systems of government. And so I want to make sure we touch on how we can support young people in doing that and what we should be doing to support them, but also what are some tangible things that young people can engage in exercising their agency and power.
I remember that when we were talking as a panel in preparation for this, we said, gosh, isn't that the $1 million question, right? And where we landed was the solutions are simple when we just think about it theoretically, but they're complicated when you think about how to implement. But whether you see it as simple or complicated, they're necessary nonetheless. So these things have to happen. I'm happy to take a stab at the adult role. You know, I think where I landed on this, and I know I share some similar ideas with those others on the panel, is that with the adults, I think we have a role, we have a responsibility to protect spaces where children and youth can really develop their own unique identities in a way that's valued and celebrated. And that often doesn't happen in some communities. That we need to create those spaces so that wherever we encounter them, so whether it's our agencies, our communities, our schools, that space that adults hold, we're not only protecting that space, but fighting combating the systems that try to place harmful labels and identities that are manufactured or reproduced or institutionalized in ways that actually cause harm to children and youth. We as adults can do that. We want to fight the systems that really place harm and limit what children can do. And I think that if we do this job well, children and youth are going to be able to find their voice. They're going to be able to find their power, their sense of agency, and they're going to have a port to flourish. But the adults have to begin by creating that structure and framework for them in all of our respective spaces.
You know, it makes me think about sort of what's expertise. So what is adult expertise versus what is youth expertise? And Amy, I think you're touching on it. I mean, our expertise as adults is to create those opportunities and make sure that there are those opportunities, because we're up against another form of marginalization in this country, which is the marginalization of youth voices. Youth are seldomly consulted with in terms of their experiences of these things, of these kinds of issues, their ideas about why these kinds of things happen, and even more so, what kinds of ideas might they have about sort of countering some of these dynamics. And you're right, I think I think complex problems require complex solutions. So I don't have the answers. I mean, I know that it's exciting to sit at a table with a group of 7th and 8th graders having conversations about the what is and the how they're impacted, and then where do we go with this? Because some of the ideas they come up with are fed by their own lived experiences and their own imagination. But I think I think we have to step back and look at what is our realm of expertise and what do we need to do as adults, and then sort of get out of the way and allow youth expertise and voice to come forward.
Likewise, Alec, I've had the opportunity of working at the ground stages of planning for the Healing Leading Change initiative, and in thinking about measurement and thinking about theories of change. One particular approach that I believe will be instrumental in the work of this is the potential of youth participatory evaluation. And that's just simply an approach to evaluation that engages young people in evaluating the program. It does not have to be centered by adults. And when we think about measurement, it can be centered by the voice and perspective of youth and the issues that they endure and how they see from the lens of racial-based trauma. And within this approach, our hope is that the youth can help build tools, actually conduct research, and be a voice, as opposed to the onus of adults to say what is the problem and what should be the solution. But I think from this perspective, we're looking to build a program, an initiative, and also the appropriate measurement platform where youth will build it, and they will be the voice of what is the impact and what should this impact look like. So it's not all developed as far as the evaluation and measurement side of things, but I think that I would be excited to see what youth can actually contribute to this. And I know the sky's the limit for what they'll be able to do.
Yeah, just real quickly, I'll add that, organized people defeat organized power. And for us, I think it's imperative to create safe spaces for multiple generations to gather, for us to mobilize and organize around a common agenda that is going to bring about the justice that we're desperately after. I just think about a quote from Dr. King, where he said, oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself, right? But that manifestation is going to come by way of us acting towards the type of change that we want to see in the society writ large. And a lot of our young folks are brilliant, they're intelligent, they have fresh ideas. And in many cases, we just need to create the atmosphere for them to thrive and flourish and just get out of their way. Even if you think about not just the civil rights movement, but the Black liberation movement that took place between the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. When you think about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee with H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael, Congressman John Lewis, when you think about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, when you think about CORE, when you think about the Urban League and all of these prominent civil and human rights institutions, they were led by young folks, right? And in many cases, the generation that came before them did not want to support them, right? And so they had to go out here and create their own institutions to move an agenda that had equity, justice, and liberation at the center, right? And I see somebody put in the chat, the Black Panthers. They're definitely another organization when you think about individuals like Chairman Fred Hampton, right? And so I think that we have examples that we can build on to help get us to where we're ultimately trying to go. And if even if we just use the example of 2020, right, and the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that has been happening along those lines, I think we're in a pretty good position to continue to move this ball further down the field. But there does need to be a more structured pathway forward. I will say that. And so that means that all of us who are links in the chain, we need to come together behind closed doors and try and figure out what is it that we do best and how we can play off of each other's strengths to get this work done.
And I think the beauty of what Bright Promises has done is it has brought all of us together, not just for this event, but in other consultation events where we get to speak to one another, different populations, all focused on children and youth. So we're not operating in silos. So Clinton, to your point, let's talk. Let's build a structure so that we can make movement beyond what we have now.
I think it's like, make this a priority. Like, we've been talking about this stuff for so long. And it's like, I'm just going to say it. Like, let's just put our money where our mouths are. And let's make this a priority. Let's come together. We can't sort this out alone. We have to create partnerships. We have to come to tables. We have to sort of talk this through because there's no easy answers here. And so until it's a priority, both a political priority, a funding priority, until groups of adults open the doors to the young people, invite them to the table and listen and start putting action behind some of these ideas, we're not, we're going to keep spinning. So it's like, I think it's really, and that's what's exciting about my participation in what Bright Promise has done, and meeting people like Amber and Clinton and Amy and Ed. It's just been so inspiring. But I think until we really just roll up our sleeves and recognize that this is a party that we have to kind of keep banging away at. Like, let's not just, when this thing ends, go home and talk about how wonderful this conversation might have been, could have been, and move on with it. Let's keep going. Part 2, part 5, part 100. Let's keep going.
Well, we certainly are committed to keeping it going, Alec, and you've been a consistent bell ringer on that point from the moment you joined this process. So thank you for that. And as we said earlier, this certainly isn't the start of the conversation, but it's in continuation of not only the conversation but the work. And hopefully, we'll do more work than talking about these issues moving forward, because that's where the change will come. So I wanted to drill down a little more specifically on ways that adults can support youth in using their power, their agency. We've heard, many of you say, youth have a lot of lived experience. They have a lot of power. They know a lot of what needs to happen to support themselves. We just need to get out of their way. But sometimes getting out of their way means that we have to move things, not just ourselves, to get out of their way. And so what can adults move? What do we need to move? And and I'll ask this a little differently. If you were sitting in front of funders, if you were sitting in front of local, state, and federal, officials, if you were sitting in front of the heads of the major nonprofits doing work in supporting young people, like, what would you tell them? What would be their get out of the way advice that would allow them to have young people grow and use the power and agency that they have?
The first thing that comes to my mind is how we have many different think tanks. So let's create a think tank. Let's create a space that sanctions young people's voices, where we maybe create a forum a bit like this, but with young people, and pose some questions, or maybe even ask them what are the questions we should be asking. I don't even know if we as adults are asking the right questions. But Ed, I think in terms of, for me, getting out of the way, it's kind of like creating the space, the table for people to come together who are, 20 and younger. I mean, we're doing some work with 6th and 7th graders that is through the roof outstanding. They're sitting in a circle and they're kind of identifying what some of the challenges are in their community and what some of the solutions might be. And then allowing those, finding the resources to bring those ideas and solutions to life. And so I guess if I was talking to funders, it's like, it's great that we have these focus groups that are us adults. Let's have these focus groups with 6th and 7th graders and high schoolers and young college folks, and see what kinds of thoughts and ideas they might have about moving this along.
Point when we think about focus groups and all thinking about parts of measurement, one thing that's important, or what we can do, is really build capacity and empower youth to be leaders. And just overall, I think about, in developing something like focus groups and think tanks, what we can do as adults is be the ones who are empowering them in their voice, in building these spaces where they have the voice to and empowering them, letting them know that they do have the knowledge base to engage in these type of conversations. And when we are having these focus groups, they are setting the tone and the type of questions that are being asked, and maybe developing youth leaders to lead these focus groups. So I think as adults, we have the responsibility of really building their capacity and empowering them to be at their best.
And building on the work that you do, Amber, in terms of evaluation and kind of thinking about what Clinton had said about structure, that we need a paradigm shift in how we think we fund programs and create programs that isn't based on metrics and deliverables that say X number of kids need to be served. It's about bringing these innovative ideas and giving more latitude for innovation rather than we as adults define a problem. We define the metrics of how we're going to measure our ability to meet that problem, because this takes more creativity. It takes, again, more innovation. It takes more just unique perspectives if we're really going to move the needle on this.
Yeah. And I mean, for me, if I was having a conversation with a room full of funders, I would really encourage them to fund program models that speak to cultural innovation, right? You know, a lot of the work that I do around Black fatherhood takes this strengths-based, assets-based approach where we really understand that Black fathers do best when they have a program curriculum, for example, that they can see themselves reflected in. That, you know, we talk about all of the wonderful things that Black men and Black fathers have contributed, not just to US civilization, but world civilization. You know, thinking about the ways in which ancient African history is also a part of our history as people who have really been disconnected from our true cultural heritage, right? And, you know, yesterday, me and some colleagues, as somebody who serves on the board of Fathers, Families, and Healthy Communities, we had a very encouraging conversation with a funder who is interested in putting some money behind an innovative program model that takes a rites of passage program and embeds it within our fatherhood program, right? Where we take older fathers who are returning home from prison, who have a true desire to give back to the community, and pairing them up with younger fathers in our program for the purpose of A, creating a shared learning community, and B, for coming together and putting a community project on the table that they can both take ownership in, right? One that is about advancing a policy agenda that has racial and social equity at the forefront. And I would just encourage other funders to, you know, also consider ways that they can support programs who are really moving beyond these Eurocentric models that don't speak to groups that have been racialized or minoritized in the US of A, because that's important. And honestly, I think that's the direction that we need to go in. And the last thing I'll say is you can't change the life cycle on a grant cycle. And so I would encourage funders to, you know, move beyond just providing funding in these short-term intervals. It being a year or two. In many cases, it's going to take us probably 5 to 10 years to really do the type of work that we want to do, knowing that we have the necessary financial support from our benefactors who are really seeding innovation, right? And understanding that there's an evaluation component that goes alongside that requires, again, to Amber's point, a great deal of innovation and thoughtfulness being brought to the table that moves beyond these the golden standard of evaluation being a randomized control trial. Let's also think about ways to take this community-based participatory action research model and embed youth voice into it and allow the beneficiaries of programming to really take lead in designing the program model and also developing the evaluation tools that are both quantitative and qualitative that are going to allow us to demonstrate to the broader public the overall efficacy or effectiveness of the program.
Absolutely. I'll just say, Clinton, you hit the nail on the head in terms of what we see. And I'll just say overall, our approach with Pi.org and what we want to do, which is to, one, take culturally responsive approach to evaluation and really understand that and not prescribe what we feel impact should be, but in a lot of cases, and specifically in this case, we need to understand what the impact of programming from the voice of youth should be as well. So definitely agree with that. And it's more than numbers, it's more than the randomized controlled trials, but really using mixed methods, because I don't steer away from numbers, but I think there's a larger story to tell, and being able to tell some of those impact stories and infuse them in the overall evaluation process.
Thank you. I want to encourage our attendees to continue to use the chat, or that we actually have a Q&A function to submit questions. We're going to turn a few questions to our panelists right now that have been coming in. But I want to start. There was a comment in the chat from someone saying that child well-being should be a priority. We need policies that shape investments in our communities, improved housing, better education, family engagement, youth employment, et cetera. And, that's really getting at like how we need to strengthen these systems in the community around families, and in this case, children and youth, versus just focusing on strengthening the children and youth to deal with systems that are broken and resources that are not nearly enough to help them thrive and achieve that well-being. So I want to come back to the healing part of this a bit, in terms of ways that we can support our young people in their healing from these adverse experiences with racially based trauma, recognizing, as we talked about earlier, oftentimes we misdiagnose what the issue is or what's happening and treat the behavior versus the underlying trauma. So if we can share, any of our panelists, Amber, Alec, Clinton, or Amy, if you can share what are some things that have helped in terms of helping young people cope with racially based trauma, and not cope with it because that seems like teaching them to live with it, but heal and build up their resilience from it. And what are some ways that haven't worked? Understanding our Eurocentric rooted sense of treatment, therapy, and counseling in this country. So I'll open that up for discussion right now.
I'll just say, I'll give my measurement perspective first, but I think you brought up a very important point when we think about the overdiagnosis of, say, special education students and students who are steered into certain systems based off of data and data without an extended story. So where I think the healing starts in my role is really taking a critical lens to how we view data, and also how we utilize the data. So what does this data say? What supports need to be in place to build these students and not misdiagnose and lead these students into systems of oppression that are not healing. So I'll say from my perspective and approach, it's really the healing starts from my role is really taking a critical lens with the data, and also helping other adults think about how we use that data to best support kids in these spaces.
Think about the birth to 5 space and how it's so important to have conversations with parents about self-worth and self-acceptance and the importance of diversity and difference. And I always pull examples of the work that we do with kids, children's books, right? Skin Like Mine, Eyes That Kiss at the Corner, All Are Welcome Here. These are tools that we use in our own program that allow families to see characters, media images of themselves, people wearing hijabs, people who speak a different language, people with a different skin tone, name that looks different, sounds different than those around them. And it can start as simple as that, the healing process of exposing families, young children, to language of acceptance and recognizing value in those ways. And then you still have to build a system around, but that's something micro that we can do in our own individual contexts.
You know, I think that this is such a complicated question, you know, how we define effective intervention. What are we aiming to quote unquote treat or improve? What are the behaviors that we deem pathological? I think, Amber, you touched on it, like this whole idea of what is disabled learning really, you know? And so for me, I think, and it's a practice that has to engage every aspect of a child's life. I mean, a parent and caregiver can only give what they got. And their system of meaning, their system of interpreting what's going on with their child, in many ways has been influenced, if not completely populated, by dominant discourse in this country. So what is normal? You know, how much of that is infused by sort of a dominant white supremacist, Eurocentric way of thinking about what is mental health and what is not? And so those are the kinds of conversations that I think we as practitioners need to have on every level, with teachers, with caregivers, even with children. It's how did you come to see yourself in these ways? And our clinicians name it. We name racism. One of our therapists shared a story of how she was working in play therapy with a second grader who was playing at one of those first-person shooting games. And he was a white police officer. And this was an African-American boy. And she started to question, like, why a white police officer? Second grader, he knew, because it was about power. It was about privilege. It was about safety. It's about, I'd rather be shooting other Black children than having white people shoot me. And these were the conversations that this therapist began to unpack and deconstruct and give sense of meaning to, and naming it. And of course, so much more work needs to happen. And then I'll just say, in terms of we're so focused on the behavior and outcomes, and raising attendance rates and increasing literacy rates and getting kids to behave and act right in a classroom. And I understand all that stuff is really important. But if all we're focused on is putting out the fires and not understanding what started the fire in the first place, it's only going to erupt the next day. And so we really need to find ways, like I said, sort of racially sensitive ways of thinking about treatment. It's not one model fits all. I would not work with a young African-American child the same way I might work with a Latinx child or a white child, and therefore, and we need to think about that. So I can go on, but I won't.
Well, thank you. We're at time, so unfortunately we can't go on. And I see this as the beginning of a lot of work for us. It's a continuation of the conversation, but also the beginning of a lot of work. A lot of great questions raised that we will answer in follow-up email, so that we can make sure we get those out to folks. But also a lot of the conversation and questions that have raised are going to generate how we organize ourselves around this work. So those who want to talk more about the healing space and what needs to happen there, those who want to talk more about what we can do to affect change within our institutions and systems, will certainly continue that conversation. And then also on the change space and in the leadership space for young people, what we can do to further create the space for their agency and power to take root, and how we can support that and using their voice in their space. So again, I want to thank all of our panelists. I know an hour's time is not nearly enough to share your brilliance, is not nearly enough to really engage our attendees. And attendees, we want you to know that moving forward, this will become a very interactive, roll up your sleeves type of conversation with you, and not just let's share with you. We want to hear from you. We want to incorporate your expertise, your experience, your thinking, and how we help children and communities across Chicago address this very important issue, and hopefully be an example of how other areas in the country can address this issue. I applaud Bright Promises efforts in this. Part of our work is to help young people, and part of our focus panel focus is to help young people develop the tools and the toolkits that we're talking about, where they're learning more about this issue and will develop tools that they share with the rest of the community about what would be most effective at helping them get to where they need to be in this space. And so I'm excited about continuing that conversation at Bright Promises, and also in our respective work across all the agencies and organizations that we deal with. And I look forward to more conversations in the future. And with that, I'll say goodbye, and see you soon, and rest up because we have a lot of work to do.